Welcome to today's Explainer. Let's dive right into one of the absolute oldest and honestly kinda strangest, but most profoundly moving books in the entire Bible. We are talking about the book of Job. It really hits this universally human chord, you know? It explores this deep, heavy, emotional landscape that, let's face it, almost every single one of us has had to navigate at some point. Because it all revolves around this one devastating question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Right? I mean, when we experience a sudden loss, or when we have to sit by and watch someone we desperately love suffer. This is exactly the dilemma that just echoes in our minds. And the wild thing is, the book of Job doesn't shy away from it at all. It's actually the Bible's most raw, honest wrestling match with that exact question. Now, to really grasp how this text tackles such a massive, heavy issue, we gotta understand how it's built. Job isn't just some straightforward historical timeline. No, it's actually this long, intricate poem. It is a dramatic, intense wrestling match between a man in absolute agony, his friends who think they have it all figured out, and eventually, God himself. It's a completely raw exploration of faith, of total loss, and ultimately of gaining God's perspective. So, the story sets the scene by being super emphatic about Job's character. He is described as perfect and upright. So we're talking about an extraordinarily good man here, someone who feared God and completely shunned evil. I mean, he had this pristine reputation, a massive loving family, incredible wealth, vibrant health. He basically had the absolute perfect life, the whole shebang. And then it's gone. In this terrifyingly sudden cascade of tragedy, he loses literally everything. His wealth? Gone. His children? Tragically killed. His health totally collapses, leaving his body covered from head to toe in these agonizing sores. He literally goes from the very pinnacle of society to sitting alone in a heap of ashes. It's a tragic descent that is honestly almost impossible to wrap our heads around. So into this nightmare, Job's friends show up to quote-unquote comfort him. And man, with friends like these, who needs enemies, right? Because they insist on this incredibly cruel, flawed logic. They basically say, hey, God doesn't let bad things happen to good people. Therefore, Job, you must have secretly sinned. But Job fiercely pushes back on that. He defends his own integrity because he knows his suffering does not equal some hidden guilt. He flat out refuses to accept their fake theology. Now, Job does plunge into the absolute depths of despair. We see that in chapters 12 through 14. But right in the middle of defending himself against these so-called friends, he utters something absolutely astonishing. He says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Just let that sink in for a second. Without a single answer as to why his life is falling apart, his faith is so deep that he chooses absolute trust over easy fake answers. And that trust, it builds to this massive climax in chapter 19. Job is at the absolute bottom. His friends have completely turned on him. He feels utterly abandoned by God, completely isolated. And yet right there, from the ash heap, he delivers this stunning, prophetic declaration. He says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. Let's actually break down exactly what Job is prophesying here, because it is absolutely miraculous. First, he speaks of a living Redeemer. Second, he says this Redeemer will literally stand on the earth in the latter day. And third, he declares that even after his skin is destroyed in the grave, in his own resurrected flesh, he will physically see God. He is literally testifying of a physical resurrection while his own physical body is rotting away. Incredible. And the absolute crucial point here is understanding exactly who he's talking about. The text reveals he is speaking of Jesus Christ. Job is prophesying this over 1,000 years before the stories of Bethlehem or the empty tomb were even written. From the ashes, Job anticipates the central promise of the restored gospel for every single person who has ever lived. Okay. So Job makes his incredible declaration, and then, finally, God answers. We get to chapter 38, and the voice of the Lord finally breaks through. But here's the crazy part. He doesn't come with some soft apologetic defense. No, he speaks to Job from the raw, terrifying power of a storm, literally out of a whirlwind. And what he says completely flips everything upside down. God opens Job's vision to the incomprehensible immensity of creation. He starts asking these majestic, mic-drop questions like, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? He asks if Job can command the morning to happen or bind the stars. It completely reframes Job's entire understanding of the universe. It's a fascinating shift, because human nature, right? We demand a logical explanation. We constantly want the why. But God instead gives Job a divine gift, perspective. He actually never explains to Job why the suffering happens. Instead, he just lifts Job up to see the world from his altitude. And that massive, transcendent view, it changes something deep inside Job. Not because he got the answers, but because he finally saw the bigger picture. So after this incredible perspective shift, the story finally brings us to a resolution. God validates Job. He calls him righteous. He honors Job's honest, gritty wrestling over his friend's shallow, fake theology. And then, Job's life, his health, his family, they are abundantly restored to him, brought back even fuller and more blessed than they were before the tragedy ever struck. Now, to really pull this together and figure out what we are supposed to take away from all this, let's look at the words of Elder Neil A. Maxwell. Elder Maxwell personally faced some very serious, life-threatening illness, so he knew a thing or two about suffering. And he spoke profoundly about this exact kind of faith that Job demonstrated, calling this refining discipline of suffering the furnace of affliction. Elder Maxwell pointed out something absolutely crucial. Our greatest spiritual growth, it rarely ever happens when life is smooth sailing. It happens right there in the ash heap. The real question God is asking us isn't, hey, did you logically comprehend everything? It's much deeper. It's, did you trust me when you didn't understand? Job held on to God straight through the fire, and God honored that trust. So, why does this matter for you and me today? Well, because Job's historical ash heap, it represents our own personal seasons of loss, of confusion, of those deep, unanswered questions we all carry. Maybe you feel like things have been incredibly unfair or ripped away from you. But the promise of this ancient text is clear. The ash heap is not the end of the story. Because we have a Redeemer, the ash heap never, ever was the end. If you happen to be in an ash heap moment right now, if you're asking hard questions and just coming up totally empty, I really want to offer you Job's anchor today. I know that my Redeemer liveth. You don't need the full picture to hold on to this. It's a simple, unbelievably powerful truth, and it is exactly the testimony that will carry you through the dark. Now, if these concepts sparked something for you today, you've got to dive into the source material yourself. Chapters 1 through 3, and then the back half of the book are just incredible. You can grab the free study guide at comefollowme.churchofjesuschrist.org. And remember, the scriptures are meant for you, exactly where you are right now. I'm going to leave you with a deeply personal challenge to carry with you this week. When you inevitably find yourself in the ash heap, and let's be real, we all do eventually, will you demand to understand everything before you take another step? Or will you look to the whirlwind and choose to trust him anyway? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.